The story of Fire Emblem Warriors 3 Hopes has been divisive among Fire Emblem fans. Some find the overall experience less than satisfying, citing lines or plot points that fall flat, an absence of features like paired or individual character endings, or one-dimensional characters that allude too frequently to the quirk that defines them. Others laud the game for its powerful character moments, a more successful exploration of morally gray scenarios than we've seen in past games, or the superb voice acting. A lot can be said about all of this, as there is a lot to praise, and a lot that could be modified, whether because its execution was lacking, or because various taste preferences and objectives could lead someone to prefer a different experience, even if the presented one isn't necessarily bad. I think these discussions are good in general, and especially appropriate for a story that has multiple routes and no canonically correct ending. That said, one of the most divisive aspects of 3 Hopes' story has been the ending. This is where I want to focus. While many fans and critics find the endings unsatisfying, some say unfinished, I want to present a case in favor of how the writers of 3 Hopes chose to conclude each path's story. While other endings could have been powerful and satisfying too, I found that each path's end was thematically appropriate, and they left me with a lot to think about. That thinking is satisfying to me, and is what compelled me to make this video essay. So let's look at the endings to Fire Emblem Warriors 3 Hopes and how they relate to the theme of each route. Again, as this video essay analyzes the end of each story, spoilers will abound. I am assuming that the viewer has either completed each route or does not mind having the plot points spoiled, both for 3 Houses and 3 Hopes. A quick note as we dive into each story. Analyzing any story is a largely subjective experience. When someone alludes to a theme or character development, these may or may not be intended by the author. Even if the insight was not intended by the author, that is okay. It is one of those thrills of creating and consuming media in any form. As we go through these routes, I will provide relevant background, a brief exploration of character and the main lord's relationships to those around them, and themes that stood out to me. I hope this helps you see why I view each ending as appropriate. If you disagree with or want to add to any part of my analysis, please comment. That is part of the discourse an author invites by putting their story out into the world, and the writers of 3 Hopes deserve to have their story discussed. Edelgard entered Gergmach with the intention of betraying Archbishop Rhea. The moment that is your first encounter with her, whether as Byleth or as Shez, is a moment that, from her view, is the middle of a much longer story. This choice was difficult for Edelgard. She went in knowing that she would betray everyone she met. She had to bear this pain silently. She knew well how the church responded to apostates. If she wanted to win, she had to be ready to leave everyone and everything behind. This defined both Edelgard and her relationships. Between her past suffering, from cruel experimentation to losing almost her entire family, and her ideal future, she adopted a very stone-cold analytical persona. She weighs decisions not on how they affect her or her loved ones, but rather on whether the calculation is likely to place the world en route to her ideal future, in which no church dogma dictates how people should live or who is worth more or less than anyone else. Even the choice to go to war was utilitarian, sacrifice thousands of lives now in exchange for a better life for hundreds of thousands in the future. Her relationships therefore have less to do with her personal feelings and more to do with the position one plays in that ideal. Hubert will go to any extreme to see that Edelgard's plans pan out. Petra is brought as a functional slave of a foreign nation, in part as collateral to keep Bridget in line, and in part as an investment for future negotiations, which puts Petra in a difficult situation that merits a video on its own. Hubert watches Ferdinand closely, knowing that his particular position makes him an important figurehead for the Empire, but also a potential enemy. Even you, playing as Shez, are a subject of distrust. Not till after years of knowing each other do you learn that you were initially hired and later given authority as a test, with the full expectation that you would turn traitor and have to be killed. I could go on, but every close tie she maintains has utility to her. Yaritza perhaps best illustrates this. Edelgard feels no tie to Emil, but he is strong. He longs to kill, and she can steer that impulse to her benefit. It's also telling that, when she does acknowledge a deep affection for her friends, if that is the right word, this feels stifled. It's a painful experience, one where high hopes stab deeper. She must always be ready to lose a a friend or see them turn away if her pursuit of her dream is too extreme. The more she lets herself feel that hope, the more she feels herself grow weak. Now let's look at how that ending reflects the character and her concerns.
This way! There's no way they could have survived that.
Well then, just one thing left.
Must we do this now? But I suppose you earned it. Just this once. At last, Fodlan has been freed from that which bound it. Today marks a momentous new chapter in its history, and we shall be its authors.
Right away we see the juxtaposition of two lives, the casual manners of a commoner with the posture and formal speech of a noble. Edelgard hesitates. The kind of friendship that includes a high five after a battle is not something she expected, and maybe something she does not or cannot let herself want in the path she has chosen. But she concedes. Shez has earned her trust. Immediately, Edelgard turns the focus to the ideal that stands ever before her. Fodlan has been freed. Today marks a new chapter. In these seconds, we see the characterization that has defined Edelgard, as well as what matters most to her. It's a bit awkwardly delivered. Admittedly, I do find the juxtaposition of casual and formal jarring, but it's effective at reminding us who she is and what she wants. That's important because of what comes next.
It is now 1183, Blue Sea Moon. The Empire has freed Garreg Mach and put the Knights of Seros and those who slither in the dark to rout. Amidst the fighting, Archbishop Rhea and Taulus both go missing. With no one to lead, the Central Church's influence wanes, and those who slither in the dark vanish. But due to Claude's breaking of a pact to serve his own ambitions, the Empire and Leicester Alliance soon return to war. Bloodshed between the three ruling powers of Fodlan, Empire, Alliance, and the beleaguered kingdom, rages on with no end in sight.
Okay, this is a bit weird, and I think why some people find this ending dissatisfying. Is it over? Edelgard just said it's finished, and a new chapter is starting. But the two villains in her life, Taulus and Rhea, aren't definitely dead, they're missing. And the Central Church doesn't die, its influence wanes, lessens, but does not disappear. Those who slither in the dark vanish. That doesn't mean they're gone or dead or finished, they vanish over and over again in every route. They live in the dark, vanished is normal for them. Furthermore, the war isn't over. Edelgard believed that one large definitive war would bring peace. This isn't what happens. The Empire and Alliance fight on, even in the ending in which Claude keeps the treaty, the war isn't over. We should also remember that Claude is always scheming, always ready to do whatever it takes to give him the advantage, and Edelgard is always ready to betray, deceive, or brute force her way to victory, no matter what gets left in the wake. They are both the kind to make and break alliances, though for different reasons. While one exists, the other will not be able to be certain of any stable peace. This war was inevitable. Something tells me that if we were to go on past the ending of Scarlet Blaze, there would never be a satisfying ending. Even if the church and kingdom fell, their ideas would persist. Claude would still be a threat, and he clearly doesn't trust Edelgard to treat the Alliance fairly, as we see in his route. If she conquered the Alliance next, there would always be the threat of nations abroad, Bridget, Almyra, and Dagda, to say nothing of internal threats from those unsatisfied with the new regime. Fodlan's history is rife with wars, divisions, shifting geopolitical power, and so on. Why should Edelgard's time be any different? The end of stories is not a thing that exists, it is simply where we choose to pause the narrative. So in sum, Edelgard's Claude's last comment evokes this ideal she's fought for, a better future. It's then immediately contradicted. Peace is still a distant dream. War rages on, with no end in sight. Claude is an outsider. His whole house and 3 houses is described as those who don't fit in, and he's the lead of the lot. His lineage and backstory are obscure. He spent a lot of time outside of Fodlan, a taboo not just for the Alliance, but also against the precepts of the Central Church, and he's positioned to inherit power. His life is a recipe for disaster. This background defines Claude. All his life, he's seen discord and what power struggles do to people's lives. In Almyra, some assortment of nobles exists, and they all vie for power. His brother Shahid tries to spark a war with Fodlan simply because it would make him stand out to the king. Each portion of Leicester is united under this common alliance, but they are definitely not one nation. Lawrence primarily exemplifies this. The nobles watch each other, suspicious of any deeds, fighting for what's best in their land, and acting in a way that most furthers their individual house's interests. One might say that Lawrence belongs to Leicester, but he belongs to Gloucester first. Think early US history in which residents identified with their state, not with being American. These loose connections define the Golden Deer House too. Little really ties them together. Yes, there are intersecting backgrounds, the paralogue with Lawrence, Ignatz, and Raphael being one of the most well-written in my opinion, but they're a strange assortment. A hunter, someone who works at a bakery, a new knight, a savant, an introvert, a lord with questionable social skills. One need look no further than Leone and Lawrence to see they do not mix when they meet. Hilda would rather be making crafts than going to war, Marianne would rather not inflict her presence on other people, Lysithea would rather not be inflicted by other people's presence. This isn't a close-knit band. Not yet. But they do grow together under Claude's leadership. Claude sees a broken world. It would be easy to disappear, but that's not what he wants, not yet. That, disappearing, is his ideal distant future, but he can't in good conscience do it, not when he has the power to change things. In this regard, he is actually quite similar to Edelgard, and it's fitting that their paths intersect. It might be more appropriate to say that their paths run parallel to each other, close, headed the same way, but never to meet. While he leads, he works tirelessly to redefine the kind of world that made growing up for him so disheartening. A world that encourages such division cannot be allowed to continue, so he fights to change it. How do his schemes work out?
Our work here isn't over. Not by a long shot. Got plenty of road ahead. But we've taken the first step. Together.
I find it interesting that Claude and Shez behave more like what I'd expected to see from Edelgard. Cautious, focused on the mission, and no cheesy high-five moment. And unlike in Scarlet Blaze, Claude's defeat of the Central Church is fairly definite. But like Scarlet Blaze, you immediately see Claude's ideal. We'll take this journey together, something uncompromising for him, though it is something his friends had to help him learn, realize, and embrace along the way. This is true of both Dimitri and Edelgard, who had to learn that it was okay to trust. As a quick aside, I loved Three Hope's more overt note that Edelgard could only afford to trust a few close people because of Hubert. His suspicion allowed Edelgard to trust, as he would bear the burden of trusting no one even if he wanted to. Hubert, like Petra, could be explored far more deeply and deserves a full video of his own, but like in Scarlet Blaze, Claude's last words are immediately contradicted in the postscript.
It is now 1183, Blue Sea Moon. The Federation has joined with the Empire to invade the Holy Kingdom of Fargus. Claude sought not to conquer the kingdom, but to destroy the Central Church. After Archbishop Brea's defeat, the Church has lost much of its martial prowess. Tensions continue between the Empire and Kingdom. Having now reached his goal, Claude proposes an end to the war, yet it remains uncertain if either side will accept.
The church lost much of its martial prowess, so a definite defeat of Rhea, but not a whole dismantling of the system, not everything he wanted, and tensions continue as they had before. I like that this ending leaves a bit more of a question in the air. Edelgard aimed for peace and she failed, Claude aimed for unity and will he fail? The end doesn't say. I could see a critic saying that this isn't an end then, or it isn't a satisfying ending, but let's assume the storyteller accomplished what they were aiming for. What then does this ending give us? A question. The question is the story. This isn't the tale of a hero who ends racism, it's a story about an outsider who hoped that he could unite people. I want to say more about this later, but first let's look at the third route. The shared defining narrative of almost everyone in the Blue Lion's house is, of course, the tragedy of Duscur. An ambush resulted in the deaths of several individuals, notable among them Dimitri's parents, King Lambert and supposedly Queen Patricia. Many others died in the assassination too, including a soldier named Glenn. The children and families of the deceased are still grappling with the aftermath when Byleth or Shez meets them. Dimitri is haunted by what he saw and by what he became while seeking revenge on the residents of Duscur. He forces himself to maintain an air of decorum, but when pushed, you see the animal slip out. Haunting memories of the deceased follow him as he feels personally responsible for being unable to save them. This incident also serves as a defining moment for many relations in the Blue Lion's house. Dedu, who was taken in by Dimitri, swears loyalty to the prince, and the prince reciprocates that loyalty as he sees in Dedu hope for his own personal humanity. Ingrid, who is Glenn's fiancée, struggles to trust Dedu or anyone from Duscur after the assassination. And Felix... there is so much to say about Felix. I'm just going to put him on the shelf with Petra and Hubert for characters that I could dissect for hours and not get tired of it, but in short, he is angry. He hates Dimitri as he saw the prince's mad rampage and holds no respect for him, calling him a boor instead of the respectful title you'd think an aristocrat would demand. Contrast that with Hubert, who immediately changes the title he uses for Edelgard upon her ascension to the throne. Felix's hatred for knightly honor defines his relationship with his father, Ingrid, and Ash, and Sylvain calls him out for it as Felix is willing to throw himself into conflict with reckless abandon to protect his friends. Everywhere you look at the Blue Lions, you see people who are broken looking for healing in their own ways.
Dimitri, go!
Uncle, no.
You cursed beasts will never defeat us! You're wrong! Not another step, you fool! This ends here!
Guess it's over.
Yes.
Dee?
Let's go. It seems the dawn is nearly upon us.
About time, too. So, my friend, shall we?
Right. There's much to be done.
Okay, This one had me divided. There are things that I love, things that confuse me, and things I wish were different, but that's okay. I like stories that make me think and feel, and well, this has certainly done both. First off, I find it interesting that in this route, Tallis dies. In Golden Wildfire, Rhea definitely dies, but it's Edelgard who really considers them as enemies, and in her route, their deaths are uncertain, as if these stories were constructed to be less than definite. Now, let's look at what Dimitri says and does. He leaves Edelgard behind, something he's struggled to do with any memory of his past. Then he says they have to go. Dawn is finally coming. I find this thematically appropriate for a man who's been stuck in the past, haunted by it. He's finally starting to look forward, a perspective Shez's words reflect too. And like all three routes, his last words evoke a sense of more work they need to do. We'll write history. We've taken the first step together, and there's more to be done. In all three routes, the end isn't an end, but a reminder. This is the path we're on, and we've got a long way left to go.
It is now 1183, Great Tree Moon. The Holy Kingdom of Fargus, beside the Leicester Alliance and the Church of Saros, emerged victorious against the forces of Adrestia. With the loss of Regent Ire and many of its leading strategists, the Empire has been forced back on all fronts, radically transforming the power structure throughout Fodlan. In pursuit of their ideals, the young leaders press ever southward to crush the Empire for good. None know what tomorrow this war may bring, nor what future awaits Fodlan.
And like both other routes, Geralt's monologue at the end contradicts the Lord's final words. The Empire is forced back, and Dimitri continues southward. Interesting phrasing, evoking a sense of moving backward, while Dimitri ended looking forward. Was this deliberate? I don't know, but I don't care. It's a parallel that made me pause and think. Stories should do that. You're left wanting a sense of him healing, but his focus on crushing his enemy for good, that same focus that drove the Boar Prince, leaves you feeling disconcerted. And if that imagery wasn't discouraging enough, there's a final reminder that the tomorrow to which Dimitri was looking is full of unknowns. Now, before I move on to my final thoughts on why all of these endings feel early and unfinished and why that actually works, I have to say something more about this ending in particular. In a previous scene in Three Hopes, Edelgard recalls a moment in her childhood when she fell down. Dimitri recalls finding a girl who had fallen, and he offers a hand to help her up. This moment parallels in my mind the Three Houses account of a young L and D departing ways until they would reunite traveling to Garrigmach Monastery. In that account, Dimitri gifted a dagger to Edelgard, encouraging her to cut her way forward. In both instances, you have an account of Dimitri offering a hand to Edelgard, and in both games, the end revisits this moment in a strikingly poignant way. Let's compare both characters and conclusions. A dagger is an apt symbol for Edelgard. She does cut her own way, as Dimitri encouraged her to do. She cuts ties, she resorts to brute force, and she conceals her dagger for a season with every intention of unsheathing it soon. She employs Hubert, Yaritza, Metody, even those who slither in the dark as her daggers in the night, those who will do dirty deeds that further her ambitions. Any aversions to such individuals she expresses are merely a front to preserve her image, as when she attacks Metody in the Three Houses DLC or Monica in the main story. That same willingness to think one thing and say or do something else as a mask pervades many of her interactions, such as her negotiations with Claude in Three Hopes. She even permits obsessive discipleship from Monica, someone she admits she was ready to sacrifice simply because Monica will act in her favor. Dimitri, meanwhile, binds himself by morals. He has a ruthless, darker half, but he despises it and endeavors to conceal it. When he puts on a mask of decorum, it's to fool and control himself, not others. He surrounds himself with noble knights and honorable warriors, and when he talks to them, he forgives them their faults and lifts them up. Edelgard is ready to betray anyone and have them disposed of. Meanwhile, even one death might send Dimitri over the edge. In so many ways, the two characters are ideological opposites. She embodies the dagger, cutting her way forward. He embodies the outstretched hand, supporting and needing support in return. For this reason, it seems sad but appropriate to me that in both Three Houses and Three Hopes, Dimitri plays no part in Edelgard's endings, but she is a central focus of his endings. I love that the two games deliberately paralleled each other, but it also seemed as if both plotlines were almost deliberately moving in opposite directions. Consider the following comparisons. Both games harken back to their childhood, but in Three Houses, Dimitri uses Edelgard's childhood nickname L. In Three Hopes, Edelgard uses Dimitri's childhood nickname D. Both show Edelgard as low. In Three Houses, Dimitri reaches down as if searching for that old childlike friendship they once had, and she looks up. In Three Hopes, Edelgard looks up to him as if searching for that old friend, and he looks away. The roles they play switch. In Three Houses, Dimitri is the one pleading, and a defiant Edelgard rejects him. In Three Hopes, a crushed Edelgard is the one pleading, and Dimitri rejects her. Dimitri's interaction with the protagonist also switches. In Three Houses, the ever-hopeful Dimitri turns back one more time, and Byleth pulls him away. In Three Hopes, the hardened Dimitri prompts Shez away, refusing to turn back. In both, they walk out to a cheering crowd. In Three Houses, it's a soulless, faceless crowd that doesn't understand the pain associated with victory. In Three Hopes, it's a small, personal crowd that is proud of the demons Dimitri conquered to bring them that victory. The ending poses an interesting question that I'm not sure how I would answer. In which story was Dimitri better off? Dimitri lost so much in Three Houses, but falling so low helped him stand and rise up to the status of a true noble king. He could not heal without hitting rock bottom first. It hurt, but it made for a sweeter end. In Three Hopes, Dimitri doesn't experience the same loss. Rodrigue may or may not still die, but he doesn't ever think he loses to do, and whatever cost him his eye and led to the king living in isolation in Garreg Mach doesn't happen in Three Hopes. He experiences, by comparison, less pain, but also less healing. Is this exchange worth it? I don't know, but I love the question. To assess whether any story has a good ending, or better put, an appropriate or satisfying ending, which can be good / happy or sad, you have to first be able to say what the story was about. So, what was the story of Three Hopes about? There are two ways to answer this. The first is from the Lord's perspectives. For each of the three lords, I would say that the story has an open-ended question. Can I fix the world? Thus, an open-ended nature of these endings is appropriate for two reasons. One, this is an alternate timeline telling of a story that already has branching timelines. It's an exploration of a world, not a definitive account. This is hard for some people who want to know the canon ending, or who ask for some extra path or ending that allows for all three lords, for example, to come together. What fates succumb to? What's the real story? Well, Three Houses says it's up to you. Your choice matters. Three Hopes says something comparable, but more strikingly, if you ask me, if any one story ended with something satisfying while the others did not, that might suggest that is the good ending, the right one. Three Hopes does not give you that satisfaction, and that's the point. You have to choose. But there's another opposing explanation I think I like even more. The genre of your choice matters games tends to be problematic. Too many branching options can be difficult to really explore as a creator or consumer. Often your choice doesn't really matter. All options bring you to the same plot or one of a handful of pre-packaged plots. This leaves the person trying to make choices feel constrained, an illusion of choice. Three Hopes leans into this in a way that actually worked for me. Pick a path. In the end, your choice doesn't matter. You're one person, a little mercenary. The war still happens and the story ends with a question and the world goes on. Even the big choice for you, whether or not to kill Byleth, has no impact on the bigger narrative. In the end, you play a small part and are left with only questions. Can I fix the world? No. It's more complicated than one person and their choices. Your choices don't always matter, and that has to be okay sometimes. That is a striking message. What does change is not the grand story with high stakes, but many small personal interactions. Your relationships, who you save, who you meet, who stays a stranger. In a game where characters slay gods and you play the part of kings and legends who try to alter the course of history, I like the dose of humble pie that says you can shape your small experience, but you can't solve the big problem. No matter what you do, the cycle of the world goes on. From the perspective of the three lords, did Three Houses have a good ending? Well, that is up to the reader character, but by my interpretation it had a satisfying ending. The premise of the game introduced a question: can you alter the course of history? The story gives some answers. In small personal ways, yes. In the grand scheme of things, no. No individual is big enough to have complete control. Not a lowly mercenary, not a queen who tried to end war, not an outsider who tried to end racism, and not a king who tried to save everyone. You don't have total control. Through each path, the story was the same. All the three lords could do was hope. And that's how I intended to end this video essay, but there's another ending I discovered while writing this that you might see in this game, one that's smaller, simpler, and more personal. I think I like it as a true ending if there is to be one, so let's return to that question: what is the story of Three Hopes about? My second answer is not from the perspective of the lords, but from the perspective of one lowly mercenary. Let's set aside the grand story of wars and gods and heroes and look at Shez. In Three Houses, you played as Byleth, the infamous Ashen Demon of Three Hopes. There, you were a legend and everyone gravitates toward you because of it. I feel repelled by stories like that, and it's a problem that has permeated the Fire Emblem franchise, Fates being the worst of it. The protagonist is always a great hero and everyone loves them, and if someone doesn't, either they're wrong and they'll come around, or they're the bad guy. But Three Hopes turns the table. The former protagonist now faces away from you, and you play the part of one nameless NPC who, in my headcanon, was killed by Byleth in Three Houses. But in Three Hopes, you're given a second chance as a second progenitor god enters the story to break the cycle of previous stories. The reason you hate Byleth in this game is simple. You're a nobody. You play as an orphan who never knew their parents, who lost their adoptive parent, who was cast out by their home village, and who was taken in by some nobody mercenaries who are striving to make a name for themselves. You think you're finding a place of belonging, a sort of adoptive family, and then Byleth comes along and rips it all away. In the first chapter of the game, you sit helpless as your found family dies around you, and you feel afraid as you can do nothing to avenge them. You can do nothing. The story from Shez's view is small and personal. I will take that over grandiose tales of the highest stakes any day. As much as I love God-shattering Star, I could not care less about Claude's fight against Nemesis. But Dimitri versus Edelgard, one person versus someone else, that made me feel something. Three Hopes enveloped me right away by making me care about one small merc who has one simple goal: get strong enough to achieve revenge. But revenge stories are unstable, and this one doesn't last. If you force yourself to hate Byleth to the end, you kill them and Geralt's mercenaries, and Shez expresses how hollow it feels. I felt the same way. It's interesting as a side note that in both games, Geralt dies to someone from Shambhala, possibly Three Hopes' way of putting you in the antagonist role yet again. I liked that small detail. But Shez doesn't hate Byleth. Shez hates feeling like he or she doesn't belong. That can't be fixed by killing him. Recruiting him becomes preferable as he could become an asset to a new group, your new found family. Past the last words of the lords and the records, you might see what I like to think is a journal entry from Shez, or maybe even a letter to their missing adoptive parent. The real ending for me, it doesn't wrap up the story of eternal wars or answer the larger-than-life questions, but it does bring a nice fitting conclusion to the story of one mercenary who found their place in a world larger than them. Sit back and enjoy.
What an adventure we've had. Hard to believe it all started with one little dust-up in the woods. We've seen each other through so many battles, and yet I know we've got a lot more to go. Chances are I'll stay and fight for this place, but don't hold it against me if I slip away from time to time for an adventure of my own. And while my future isn't set in stone, I know one thing for certain. Right here, right now, this is where I live and breathe.